You have already lost your country once. An empire that stretched across more than 22 million square kilometers, ruled over roughly 170 million people, and was defended by one of the largest armies in Europe had collapsed in 1917. By the early 1920s, hundreds of thousands of Russians had fled into exile after the defeat of the White Movement. Officers who had once commanded regiments, worn imperial decorations, and sworn loyalty to the Tsar suddenly found themselves scattered across Europe without a homeland, without an army, and without a flag that any government recognized. And then, less than 2 decades later, they volunteered for another war. Not for Spain, for Russia. That is the first surprise of this story. When the Spanish Civil War erupted in July 1936, the conflict looked different through Russian eyes. Across Paris, Belgrade, Brussels, and other émigré communities, former white officers watched newspaper headlines with growing intensity. They did not see simply a struggle between Spanish Republicans and Nationalists. They believed they were witnessing the next battlefield in the same war they thought had never truly ended, the war against Bolshevism. Letters written by Russian volunteers reveal the same striking phrase again and again. Spain was the continuation of the white struggle. To them, the years between Russia's civil war and Spain had been only an interruption. The enemy, in their minds, had never changed. So they enlisted. Modern historians estimate that around 150 to 170 Russian émigrés ultimately fought on Franco's side, although earlier studies suggest numbers between 80 and 150 because no complete roster has ever been found. The exact figure remains debated, but the motivation behind their decision is far clearer than the statistics. These were not fortune hunters. These were aging officers chasing a lost cause. Some had once worn the shoulder boards of Imperial Russia. Some had commanded cavalry squadrons or infantry battalions. They had survived revolution, civil war, evacuation, refugee camps, and years of exile. Now, in their 40s and 50s, they believed history had finally offered them another chance. But Spain greeted them with an unexpected humiliation. The generals of the fallen Russian Empire discovered that their old ranks meant nothing. Spanish authorities refused to recognize Imperial Russian commissions. Former generals and colonels were required to begin their service as ordinary soldiers or junior officers. Imagine spending decades earning command over thousands of men, only to stand in line once again as a recruit because your country no longer existed on any official military register. Here lies the bitter irony. They had crossed Europe to fight for honor. Before firing a single shot, they had already been stripped of it. Yet almost none of them turned back. Instead, they accepted the insult, put on foreign uniforms, and marched into another country's civil war, convinced that every battle fought against communism brought them one step closer to recovering the homeland they had lost nearly 20 years earlier. They could not know that Spain would give them victory, but never give them back Russia. And for some of them, that realization would come far too late. To understand why these former imperial officers were willing to risk everything again in 1936, you first have to return to the long collapse that had begun decades before a single shot was fired in Spain. The story did not begin in Spain. It began nearly 2 decades earlier when the Russian Civil War ended with the defeat of the White Movement in the early 1920s. Thousands of officers who had fought to preserve Imperial Russia suddenly found themselves without an army to command or a country to defend. Their uniforms still carried memories of rank, but outside Russia, those ranks no longer held legal or political value. Exile became their new reality. Across Europe, former generals, colonels, and captains settled wherever they could. Some found refuge in France. Others rebuilt small Russian communities in Yugoslavia or Belgium. They organized veterans associations, attended Orthodox churches, and commemorated the comrades they had lost. Yet beneath these routines lay a conviction that never disappeared. The struggle against Bolshevism was unfinished. Years passed, but that belief survived. Then, in July 1936, Spain descended into civil war. To much of the world, it was a domestic conflict between Republicans and Nationalists. But for Russian émigrés, it looked painfully familiar. The Republican side included powerful left-wing forces supported by the Soviet Union, while General Francisco Franco presented himself as the leader of an anti-communist crusade. For former white officers, the choice seemed obvious. Letters written by Russian volunteers repeatedly described the Spanish conflict as the continuation of the white struggle. They believed they had finally found another battlefield on which they could continue the war they had lost in Russia. Modern historians estimate that approximately 150 to 170 Russian volunteers ultimately fought for Franco, although earlier research suggested anywhere from 80 to 150, because no complete roster has survived. Their military impact remained limited, but their symbolic importance to the Russian émigré community became enormous. But reality quickly challenged their expectations. Spanish military authorities refused to recognize Imperial Russian commissions. A man who had once commanded entire regiments could arrive in Spain only to discover that he would serve as an ordinary soldier or junior officer. Years of service to the Russian Empire counted for nothing inside Franco's army. Here was another cruel twist of fate. They had escaped one revolution only to discover that history had erased their identities. Yet almost none of them abandoned the mission. Instead, they accepted the humiliation, fastened unfamiliar insignia to their uniforms, and prepared to fight once more, believing that victory in Spain might become the first step toward reclaiming Russia itself. But the battlefield waiting for them would demand far more than wounded pride. The moment that changed everything came in the summer of 1936, when Spain entered the darkest chapter of its modern history. On July 17th, 1936, a military uprising began in Spanish Morocco. Within days, the rebellion spread to mainland Spain. The country split between the Republican government and the nationalist forces led by General Francisco Franco. For the world, it was the beginning of a civil war. For Russian émigrés, it looked like something much older returning. A familiar enemy. Communism. Across Europe, former white officers followed the news from Spain with intense attention. They had spent almost 20 years living with the memory of defeat. They had escaped Russia after the Bolsheviks won the Civil War, carrying only what they could save: family photographs, military decorations, and the belief that their struggle had not ended. Now, Spain offered them another battlefield, but the reality waiting for them was far more complicated than they imagined. The first Russian volunteers arrived hoping their experience would be recognized. Among them were former officers of the Imperial Russian Army and veterans of the White Armies. They had commanded troops during the Russian Civil War and had decades of military experience behind them. But Franco's commanders did not see them as restored Russian officers. They saw them as foreign volunteers. Spanish authorities refused to recognize their old imperial ranks. A former Russian general could not simply arrive in Spain and continue wearing the authority he once possessed. The collapse of the Russian Empire had followed these men across borders, and now even their military identity existed only in memory. Despite this humiliation, they continued forward. One of the most important figures among them was General Anatoly Vladimirovich Foch, a former White Army officer who became one of the leading representatives of the Russian volunteers fighting for Franco. To these men, Foch represented something more than a commander. He represented the last connection to the world they had lost. But the Spanish battlefield did not care about old titles. In 1937, General Foch was killed during the fighting. His death became a powerful symbol among Russian émigrés. A man who had survived the collapse of Imperial Russia, the Russian Civil War, and years of exile, had finally fallen in another country's conflict, still fighting the same enemy he believed had destroyed his homeland. And then came another painful reality. The Russians were never allowed to create a completely independent Russian military unit under their own command. After Foch's death, General Nikolai Shinkarenko became one of the leading figures among the volunteers and attempted to secure the creation of a separate Russian formation. But Franco's command refused. The Russians had come to Spain hoping to rebuild their lost military identity. Instead, they were absorbed into foreign formations, including the Spanish Foreign Legion and the Carlist recruit units. And the greatest irony was still ahead. They were fighting for a victory they believed would restore their honor. But the first battles would show them that even an ally's army could treat them as men without a country. For the Russian officers who arrived in Spain, the war was supposed to be a path back to history. Instead, it became another chapter of exile. By the time they entered Franco's forces, they had already experienced one of the greatest collapses of the 20th century. They had watched the Russian Empire disappear in 1917, seen the White armies defeated by the early 1920s, and spent nearly 2 decades living as foreigners. But they still carried the same dream. They believed that if communism could be defeated somewhere else, perhaps the road back to Russia would open. Among these men, General Anatoly Vladimirovich Foch became one of the most respected figures. Before Spain, he had been a veteran of the White movement and represented the old military tradition of Imperial Russia. His reputation gave hope to younger émigrés who believed that the Russian military spirit had survived despite the destruction of their homeland. When he arrived in Spain, however, he faced a painful reality. His past no longer protected him. The Spanish command structure did not restore his former rank. Like other Russian officers, he had to serve within a foreign army that viewed him not as a Russian general, but as a volunteer from another country. The medals and titles earned during the Russian Civil War belonged to a world that no longer existed. Yet Foch continued. He fought alongside Franco's forces, convinced that this struggle had a greater meaning. For him and many others, Spain was not simply about Spain. It was about revenge against the ideology that had destroyed their homeland. But war rarely follows the dreams of those who enter it. In 1937, General Foch was killed in combat. His death shocked the Russian émigré community. A man who had survived revolution, civil war, and years of displacement had finally fallen on foreign soil. There was a painful irony in his fate. He had spent his life fighting for the return of Russia. He died before ever seeing it again. After Foch's death, another Russian officer, General Nikolai Shinkarenko, became one of the leading voices among the volunteers. Shinkarenko tried to achieve what many Russian émigrés wanted: the creation of a separate Russian military formation inside Franco's army. They wanted their own commanders, their own flag, their own identity. But Franco's leadership rejected the idea. The Nationalist command preferred to place foreign volunteers inside existing Spanish formations rather than create independent units that could develop their own political influence. So the Russian officers were divided among different formations. Some served in the Spanish Foreign Legion. Others joined the Carlist recruit units, fighting alongside Spanish traditionalists. They had crossed Europe hoping to rebuild a lost army. Instead, they became soldiers without a country, fighting under another nation's command. The Russian officers who fought for Franco were not only fighting on foreign soil, they were carrying the weight of an entire destroyed social class. The men who arrived in Spain in the late 1930s were survivors of a much larger catastrophe. The Russian Revolution of 1917 had destroyed the world they came from. The empire that had supported aristocrats, military families, and imperial officers disappeared, and a new Soviet state replaced it. For these exiles, losing Russia meant losing everything connected to their former identity. Their titles, their careers, their property, their place in society. After the Bolsheviks took power, former imperial officers and members of the old elite faced persecution, imprisonment, exile, and execution. The revolution did not only remove a government, it attempted to erase an entire social order that had existed for generations. By the time these men reached Spain, many had already spent almost 20 years as refugees. But there was another wound that followed them everywhere. They had become people without legal belonging. The Russian Empire no longer existed. The Soviet government considered many white émigrés enemies. Foreign countries accepted them as refugees, but rarely treated them as citizens with a secure future. And then Spain offered them a strange opportunity, a chance to fight again. But the same problem followed them into Franco's army. Their previous lives had no official recognition. A Russian colonel could not simply become a Spanish colonel. A former general could not automatically command troops. The old hierarchy they had spent decades building had vanished. This was the tragedy of the white officers. They were not ordinary soldiers searching for adventure. They were men who had already lost one country and were trying to defend the memory of another. After joining Franco's forces, many hoped that military service would finally restore their dignity. They believed that if the Nationalists won, the world would recognize their sacrifice and perhaps open new possibilities for Russian anti-communists. But victory brought a different reality. When the Spanish Civil War ended in 1939, Franco's forces had won. The Russian volunteers had survived the fighting, and they participated in the victory celebrations. They marched separately during the victory parade, carrying the Imperial Russian flag as a symbol of the homeland they had lost. For a brief moment, it appeared that history had rewarded them, but the celebration ended quickly. The new Spain had its own priorities. Most Russian volunteers did not receive the influential positions or comfortable future they had imagined. After demobilization, some remained in Spain with limited resources and had to search for ordinary work to survive. Here was the cruelest irony. They had fought because they wanted to restore the honor of Russian officers. But after the war, many discovered that they were still refugees. The battlefield had ended. The exile had not. And then, only 2 years later, a new war began that would once again force these men to choose a side, a decision that would change the fate of the remaining Russian volunteers forever. The victory of Franco in 1939 was supposed to be the moment when Russian volunteers finally received recognition. Instead, for many of them, it became the beginning of another struggle. The battlefield disappeared, but exile remained. The Russian officers who had fought in Spain carried impressive histories behind them. Some had served the Russian Empire before 1917. Others had fought in the White Armies during the Russian Civil War. They had lost their homeland once and believed that Spain would give them a chance to recover their dignity. But after the war ended, they discovered a painful truth. A victory in Spain could not restore the Russia they had lost. One of these men was General Anatoly. His story ended on the battlefield in 1937, long before Franco's final victory. Foch became a symbol of the Russian volunteers because he represented an entire generation of officers who refused to accept defeat. He had survived the destruction of the empire, escaped the collapse of the White Movement, and continued fighting thousands of kilometers away from home. But Spain became his final battlefield. His death showed the tragic reality of the Russian exiles. They were men who kept fighting for a country that no longer existed, Another figure was General Nikolai Shinkarenko, who continued the effort to preserve Russian military identity inside Franco's forces after Foch's death. He tried to create a separate Russian unit, believing that these volunteers needed their own command structure and traditions. But Franco's government rejected the proposal. The Russians were not allowed to rebuild their own army. They remained foreign soldiers inside a Spanish victory. And then came the lives of ordinary volunteers, the men who had no famous titles but carried the same dreams. Some returned to civilian life after demobilization with little money and few opportunities. A former officer who had once commanded troops could now find himself searching for ordinary employment simply to survive. The skills that had made him valuable on a battlefield meant little in a peaceful society. Some Russian veterans remained connected through émigré organizations and Orthodox communities. They preserved military traditions, remembered fallen comrades, and continued to tell younger generations about the Russia they had lost. But time was not on their side. The men who had left Russia after 1917 were growing older. The country they remembered existed only in photographs, military ceremonies, and personal memories. Then, another historical storm arrived. In 1941, Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union with Operation Barbarossa. For some former Russian volunteers who had fought for Franco, this appeared to be the final opportunity to return to Russian soil and continue their anti-Soviet struggle. They joined the Spanish Blue Division, believing they were once again moving toward the goal that had shaped their entire lives. But this decision would create a new tragedy, because the enemy of their enemy was not the liberator they imagined. And the next chapter would reveal how a generation of Russian exiles discovered that choosing a battlefield did not always mean choosing their destiny. For the Russian officers who fought for Franco, the end of the Spanish Civil War in 1939 did not bring peace. It only opened another dangerous chapter. These men had already lost one homeland. Now they found themselves trapped between powerful states, uncertain alliances, and another global conflict approaching. Their entire lives have been shaped by one goal: defeating the Soviet system that had destroyed the world they knew. Then, in June 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. For some Russian veterans of Franco's army, this appeared to be the moment they had been waiting for. They believed that the German attack could finally create a path back to Russia, not as refugees, not as exiles, but as soldiers returning to complete the fight they had started after 1917. Some former Russian volunteers from Spain joined the Spanish Blue Division, División Azul, a formation created by Franco's Spain that fought alongside Germany against the Soviet Union on the Eastern Front. Their motivation was not simple loyalty to Germany. Many saw the conflict through the same lens they had used during the Spanish Civil War, as another battle against communism. They believed they were fighting for the liberation of Russia. But history created another bitter irony. The Soviet Union they wanted to defeat was not the only power shaping their fate. Nazi Germany had its own plans for Eastern Europe, and those plans were not based on restoring an independent Russia. They were based on conquest and control. As the war continued, some Russian émigrés began to understand that they had placed their hopes in another empire that viewed them as tools rather than partners. The dream of returning home became more complicated. They had fought against one totalitarian system, hoping to destroy it, only to discover that the enemy of their enemy did not necessarily share their vision of Russia. For Russian exiles, this was one of the greatest tragedies of the 20th century. They had spent years searching for an ally strong enough to defeat the Soviet Union. But every alliance came with conditions, and every battlefield demanded a price. The danger was not only political. After the Second World War ended in 1945 Russian émigrés across Europe faced new fears. Those who had fought against the Soviet Union worried about forced repatriation, punishment, or disappearance if they fell into Soviet hands. For decades, many white Russian communities had survived by staying together, protecting their traditions, and avoiding attention from governments that viewed them with suspicion. But now the world had changed again. The Soviet Union emerged from the war as one of the most powerful states on Earth. The men who had spent their lives fighting against it were left facing an impossible question. Where could they go when the enemy they had fought still existed, but the Russia they wanted to save was gone forever? And the answer would reveal the true cost of being a soldier without a country. The story of the Russian officers who fought for Franco was never only about a small group of soldiers. It was part of a much larger tragedy that reshaped Europe during the first half of the 20th century. These men represented one of the largest waves of political exile in modern history. After the Russian Civil War ended in the early 1920s, hundreds of thousands of Russians left their homeland. Among them were officers, aristocrats, intellectuals, diplomats, and members of families that had served the Russian Empire for generations. They carried with them memories of a vanished world. But the world around them continued changing. The Russian Empire had disappeared in 1917. The Spanish monarchy had been replaced by a republic in 1931. Spain itself was torn apart by civil war between 1936 and 1939. Then Europe entered the Second World War in 1939, creating new borders, new alliances, and new ideological conflicts. For Russian émigrés, these events were connected by one central question. What happens to people when the country they belong to no longer exists? The officers who fought for Franco believed that military action could restore the past. They saw communism not only as a political system, but as the force responsible for destroying their families, careers, and national identity. However, the geopolitical reality was far more complicated. The victory of Franco in Spain did not lead to the collapse of the Soviet Union. The participation of Russian volunteers did not change the balance of power in Europe. Their sacrifices were remembered inside émigré communities, but internationally their role remained limited. This was the painful difference between symbolism and power. A small group of Russian officers could preserve the memory of Imperial Russia, but they could not bring the empire back. After 1945, the world entered the Cold War. Europe became divided between Western countries and the Soviet sphere of influence. The very system these Russian exiles had fought against survived and expanded its influence across Eastern Europe. For them, history had created an almost impossible situation. They had spent decades fighting for the return of Russia. But the Russia they wanted to restore had disappeared forever. The old imperial order could not return. The aristocratic society that had produced generations of officers was gone. The military traditions they defended existed mainly in exile organizations, family memories, and historical documents. And yet, their story reveals something important about the 20th century. Wars are not only fought by governments and armies. They're also fought by people carrying memories of lost worlds. The Russian volunteers in Spain were not powerful enough to change history, but they demonstrated how deeply the fall of an empire could shape human lives decades later. There were soldiers fighting for a homeland that existed only in memory. And after the guns stopped, they faced the final battle of exile. How do you preserve an identity when the entire world that created it has disappeared? For the Russian officers who fought for Franco, survival itself became a lifelong struggle. They had entered the 20th century as citizens of a great empire. Some had worn the uniforms of Imperial Russia, commanded troops, and belonged to a military tradition that stretched back generations. But by the middle of the century, They were living in a completely different world. The empire was gone. The army was gone. And the homeland they remembered existed only in their memories. After the Second World War ended in 1945, Russian émigré communities continued rebuilding their lives across Europe and beyond. Some remained in Spain, where they created small communities and preserved Russian traditions. Others moved to France, Belgium, Germany, or the United States, searching for greater stability. But their lives rarely followed the path they had imagined. A former officer who once commanded soldiers could spend his final decades working in ordinary professions. Military decorations that once represented honor became family possessions stored in drawers. Photographs of lost comrades replaced the battlefields where those men had once fought. The younger generation faced a different reality. Children and grandchildren of Russian exiles grew up outside Russia. They learned new languages, attended foreign schools, and built careers in countries that their parents had never considered home. For them, Russia was often a place of family stories rather than personal experience. Yet the memory of exile remained powerful. Russian émigré organizations continued preserving documents, military traditions, and stories of the white movement. They held commemorations for fallen officers and maintained connections between families scattered across different countries. The passage of time slowly transformed these former enemies of the Soviet Union from political figures into historical witnesses. Then, decades later, the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 created a new chapter. For the first time in more than 70 years, descendants of Russian émigrés could visit Russia without the political barriers that had existed throughout the Soviet period. Some families returned to search for lost homes, military records, and information about relatives who had disappeared during revolution and civil war. But a complete return was impossible. The Russia they had dreamed about was not the Russia that existed after 1991. The imperial society these officers had fought to preserve had vanished. The world of aristocratic families, imperial regiments, and old military traditions belonged to history. Their descendants carried something different. Not a country, a memory. Some descendants became historians, writers, and researchers who documented the experiences of Russian exile. Others lived quiet lives far from politics, carrying only family stories about ancestors who fought in distant wars. There was a final irony in their journey. The men who fought for Franco wanted to restore the past, but history gave them something else. It gave them survival. Their greatest victory was not rebuilding the empire they lost. It was ensuring that the story of that lost world was not forgotten. And today, their descendants continue asking the same question that followed these officers across Europe. If a homeland disappears, can the people who remember it ever truly go home? Today, the story of the Russian officers who fought for Franco exists mostly through archives, family memories, and the descendants who inherited the memories of a vanished world. The men who marched through Spain in the late 1930s are almost all gone. Their battles ended decades ago. Their uniforms have become museum pieces. Their medals are now historical objects. But their story remains because it represents something larger than one war. It represents the struggle of people who lost their homeland and spent the rest of their lives searching for a place in a changing world. The descendants of these Russian exiles can now be found across different countries, including Spain, France, the United States, and other parts of Europe. Some preserved their family histories through documents and photographs. Others researched the military paths of their ancestors, trying to understand why men who had already lost everything chose to fight again in another country. For these families, the Spanish Civil War was not simply a distant historical event. It was a personal memory, a grandfather who disappeared into exile, a great-grandfather whose medals survived longer than his country, a family name connected to an empire that no longer existed. The Russian officers who fought for Franco believed that courage and sacrifice could restore what had been destroyed. They believed that another victory might open the road back home. But history offered them a different ending. They won battles in Spain. They survived wars. They preserved their traditions. Yet they never regained the Russia they had known. There is a powerful irony in their story. These men spent their lives fighting against being forgotten. They wanted the world to remember the Russian Empire, the White Movement, and the soldiers who refused to surrender after 1917. And in the end, their greatest achievement was not political. It was memory. Their lives remind us that the fall of a country does not only change borders and governments. It changes families. It changes identities. It forces ordinary people to answer impossible questions. Who are you when your nation disappears? What remains when your titles, possessions, and achievements are taken away? And how long can a person continue fighting for a past that can never return? The Russian volunteers in Franco's army were not simply soldiers. They were survivors of a lost century. They carried the memory of Imperial Russia across Europe through revolutions, civil wars, and another world war. They showed that even when a homeland disappears from maps, it can continue living inside the people who remember it. Their story is a reminder that history is not only about winners and losers. It is about the people left behind after the flags fall. If you want to discover more forgotten stories of fallen empires, lost dynasties, and the people who survived their collapse, subscribe to the channel. These stories matter because they preserve the human side of history, the lives behind the battles, and the names behind the events. But one question remains. If you lost your homeland forever, would you spend your life trying to restore it, or would you choose to build a new future somewhere else?